I stood in the packed conference room as Brandon Garrison, our newly appointed HR head and the CEO's son, announced that any employee caught job searching would have their quarterly bonus docked. My stomach dropped. Weeks later, at the quarterly board meeting, an external auditor reviewed my file and suddenly stopped mid-sentence. He started laughing. Brandon's smirk vanished as the auditor slid a document across the mahogany table. The CEO's face turned ashen. I realized my carefully documented evidence had just detonated. 3 months before that board meeting, my life at Garrison Technologies looked completely different. I had spent 7 years building my career at this mid-sized software development firm in Austin, Texas. Starting as a junior project coordinator right out of college, I worked my way up through dedication and long hours. At 32 years old, I had finally reached senior project manager, a position I earned through consistent performance and genuine care for my team. Those 7 years meant something to me. I stayed late when deadlines loomed. I mentored junior staff members, watching them grow into confident professionals. I never missed a deadline, never dropped the ball on a client relationship. My performance reviews from Margaret, our previous HR director, reflected this commitment. Every annual review praised my leadership, my attention to detail, my ability to handle pressure. Just before Margaret retired 6 months earlier, my team successfully delivered a major project for a client in the aerospace industry. The contract was worth $2 million, and we brought it in on time and under budget. The client sent a glowing testimonial letter that Margaret placed in my personnel file. She told me privately that she was recommending me for promotion to Director of Project Management. My annual bonus was supposed to be $15,000 that year, reflecting my contribution to the company's success. Margaret's retirement party was bittersweet. She had been with Garrison Technologies for 23 years, and everyone respected her fairness and professionalism. She knew every employee by name. She understood that HR existed to support both the company and its people, not to create an adversarial relationship. When she gave her farewell speech, she emphasized the importance of treating employees with dignity and respect. 2 weeks after Margaret left, everything changed. Brandon Garrison arrived at the company on a Monday morning in late January. He was 28 years old, fresh from a failed startup in Silicon Valley that burned through $3 million of investor money in 18 months. Despite holding an MBA from a mediocre business school and having zero HR experience, he was appointed head of human resources. The reason was obvious to everyone. He was the CEO's son. Richard Garrison, our CEO, had built Garrison Technologies from nothing 30 years ago. He was a brilliant engineer who understood software development and client relationships. But like many founders, he struggled with the line between family and business. When Brandon's startup collapsed, Richard brought him home and gave him a senior leadership position he hadn't earned. Brandon's first all-hands meeting happened on a Friday afternoon. The entire company crammed into the largest conference room. About 200 employees standing shoulder to shoulder. Brandon stood at the front with a wireless microphone, wearing an expensive suit that looked too formal for our casual tech culture. His presentation slides used corporate jargon that felt empty and threatening. He announced what he called new accountability measures and performance optimization protocols. His tone was condescending, like he was addressing children rather than experienced professionals. He referred to us as human capital assets, a phrase that made my skin crawl. We weren't people to him. We were resources to be managed and optimized. Then came the policy that would change everything. Brandon clicked to a slide with bold text. Performance Accountability Initiative. He explained that anyone caught job searching during work hours or using company resources would face immediate corrective action. He said the word corrective with particular emphasis, letting it hang in the air like a threat. He claimed this policy would improve loyalty and reduce turnover costs. I looked around the room. Experienced engineers, project managers, accountants, and administrators all wore the same expression of disbelief. We had never needed such a policy before. Margaret had understood that employees sometimes explored opportunities. It was natural, even healthy. As long as people fulfilled their commitments and gave proper notice, she respected their career decisions. But Brandon wasn't finished. He announced that all department heads would now attend weekly performance accountability meetings. These weren't collaborative planning sessions. They were interrogations where we would justify our team's existence and defend our value to the company. After the meeting ended, people filed out quietly. The usual Friday afternoon energy was gone. In hushed conversations by the coffee station and in parking lot clusters, long-term employees expressed concern. Something felt fundamentally wrong. My first performance accountability meeting with Brandon happened the following Wednesday. I arrived at his office prepared with my team's metrics, project completion rates, client satisfaction scores, budget adherence. I was proud of our results. Brandon barely glanced at my presentation. Instead, he leaned back in his leather chair and criticized my team's lack of innovation. He said we were too focused on meeting client requirements and not enough on pushing boundaries. When I pointed out that our clients were extremely satisfied and that meeting requirements was literally our job, his expression turned cold. "You need to think bigger, Wilma," he said. "This company needs disruptors, not people who just follow instructions." I left his office confused and unsettled. My team had delivered exceptional results. We had happy clients and a strong track record. But somehow, in Brandon's assessment, we were inadequate. 2 weeks after that all-hands meeting, I witnessed the first casualty of Brandon's new regime. David, a software engineer who had worked at Garrison Technologies for 9 years, was called into HR. He emerged from the meeting pale and shaken. Over coffee in the break room, he told me what happened. Brandon informed him that his quarterly bonus was being reduced from $4,000 to $2,000 due to performance issues. When David asked what specific issues, Brandon mentioned vague concerns about productivity and team collaboration that had never been documented in any previous review. David was devastated. He had a new baby at home and a mortgage. That bonus money was earmarked for nursery furniture and medical bills. He asked Brandon for a formal performance improvement plan so he could address the concerns. Brandon refused, saying the issues weren't severe enough to warrant formal documentation, just severe enough to cut his bonus in half. I started paying closer attention. Over the next week, I learned that 3 more employees had their bonuses reduced or eliminated entirely. All of them shared something in common. They had recently updated their LinkedIn profiles or been contacted by recruiters. One woman in accounting had simply added a certification she earned. Another engineer had accepted a LinkedIn connection from a recruiter, nothing more. A project coordinator had updated her skills list. None of them had formal performance improvement plans. None had received prior warnings. Their most recent performance reviews, all written by Margaret before she retired, were positive. But Brandon's new assessments painted them as barely competent employees who should be grateful to still have jobs. The pattern was clear. Brandon wasn't managing performance. He was punishing anyone who might consider leaving or who showed any independence. He was creating a culture of fear. The next Monday morning, I arrived at work to find a voicemail from a recruiter at Tech Forward Solutions, one of our competitors. I listened to the message during my lunch break, sitting in my car in the parking lot. The recruiter had gotten my name from a mutual professional contact and wanted to discuss a senior leadership opportunity. Her tone was professional and respectful. I wasn't interested in leaving Garrison Technologies. Despite Brandon's arrival, I loved my team and my work. I had invested 7 years here. So I called the recruiter back using my personal cell phone and politely declined, explaining that I was happy in my current position. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. The next morning, my phone rang at 8:30. Brandon's assistant asked me to come to his office immediately. I walked down the hallway with a sense of dread I couldn't explain. When I entered his office, Brandon was sitting behind his desk with his laptop turned toward him. He didn't invite me to sit. He rotated the laptop screen so I could see it. My LinkedIn profile filled the display. "Are you actively job searching, Wilma?" he asked. I was confused. "No, I'm not. I haven't updated that profile in over 2 years." He smiled. but there was no warmth in it. That's interesting. Because a recruiter from Tech Forward contacted you yesterday, and you returned her call. That sounds like active job searching to me. My heart started pounding. She contacted me, unsolicited through a mutual connection. I called her back to politely decline. I told her I was happy here. You can verify that if you want. Brandon leaned forward. The evidence suggests otherwise. This demonstrates a lack of loyalty to Garrison Technologies and your position here. I felt my face flush with anger and fear. That's not fair. I did nothing wrong. I received an unsolicited contact and declined it. That shows loyalty. Not the opposite. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a document. This is a performance improvement plan dated 3 months ago. Signed by Margaret before she retired. It cites several concerns: missed deadlines, poor team management, and client complaints about your communication style. I stared at the document in shock. I had never seen it before. Margaret had never mentioned any of these issues. In fact, my last review with her was glowing. She recommended me for promotion. This isn't real, I said. I never received this document. Margaret never raised any of these concerns. This is completely fabricated. Brandon's expression remained neutral. Personnel matters are confidential, Wilma. Margaret documented her concerns appropriately. Just because you disagreed with her assessment doesn't make it fabricated. I need to see the specific examples, I said. Show me the missed deadlines. Show me the client complaints. Show me any documentation of these supposed issues. He closed the folder. Personnel documentation is confidential. I'm not required to share details with you beyond what's necessary for your improvement. Then he delivered the blow I was expecting. Your quarterly bonus of $5,000 is being adjusted to $500, effective immediately. This adjustment reflects the performance concerns documented in your file and your recent behavior suggesting divided loyalty. I left his office shaking. $500 instead of $5,000. That money was supposed to cover a new roof for my house. I had already gotten contractor quotes based on my expected bonus. But the money wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the lie, sitting in my personnel file. A fabricated document claiming Margaret had identified performance problems that never existed. Brandon was rewriting history, and I had no way to defend myself. That evening, I reached out to David and the others who had experienced similar situations. We met at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office, far enough away to avoid accidental encounters with colleagues. There were 5 of us initially. David, Sarah from accounting, 2 software engineers named Tom and Jennifer, and me. We compared stories. The pattern was identical for everyone. Fabricated or exaggerated performance issues. Accusations of job searching based on minimal or non-existent evidence. Bonus reductions ranging from 50% to 100%. And most disturbing, documentation that appeared in our files that we had never seen before and that contradicted our actual performance history. Sarah dropped a bombshell. She worked closely with Brandon's assistant and had access to areas of the office most people didn't see. One afternoon, she walked past a conference room and saw Brandon's assistant printing documents and manually writing dates on them. The dates she was adding were from months earlier, during Margaret's tenure. Sarah didn't say anything at the time because she didn't want to risk her job, but now, the significance was clear. They were backdating fraudulent documents. We discussed going to the CEO, but everyone was terrified of further retaliation. Brandon was Richard Garrison's son. Would Richard really choose employees over his own child? And what if we went to Richard and he sided with Brandon? We would all be fired, blackballed from the industry, potentially sued. I made a decision that night. I would document everything meticulously, every conversation, every email, every policy violation. I would build an undeniable case. And when the right opportunity came, I would present it to someone who had the power and willingness to act. I started immediately. I formally requested my complete personnel file through the company's official HR request system, citing my right under company policy to review my own records. Brandon's assistant responded that my request was being processed and would take up to 30 business days. I contacted Margaret at her home. She had moved to a retirement community in Florida and was enjoying her newfound freedom. When I explained what was happening, her voice changed from warm and friendly to horrified and angry. "Wilma, I never wrote a single negative word about you in any document," she said. "I never created a performance improvement plan for you. I recommended you for promotion. I told Richard directly that you were one of the most valuable managers in the company. What Brandon is doing is fraud. Would you be willing to provide a sworn statement to that effect?" I asked. "Absolutely," she said without hesitation. "I'll write it tonight and have it notarized tomorrow. This is wrong, and I won't let my name be used to destroy good people's careers." Over the next 2 weeks, I became meticulous about documentation. I photographed my computer screen, showing the recruiter's unsolicited email and my polite decline. I saved every positive performance review and project completion certificate I had received over 7 years. I kept detailed notes, with dates, times, and witnesses for every conversation with Brandon. I collected statements from team members praising my leadership. I gathered client testimonials. I also started researching employment law, whistleblower protections, and corporate fraud. I learned about the legal obligations companies have to maintain accurate personnel records. I discovered that backdating documents and fabricating performance issues could constitute fraud, especially if it affected compensation, but I still needed a path forward. Going to Richard felt futile. Going to the compromised legal department would accomplish nothing. I needed an external authority figure who couldn't be influenced by family loyalty or corporate politics. Then I remembered something. Garrison Technologies was in the process of competing for a major government contract worth $12 million. As part of the government's due diligence process, we were required to undergo a comprehensive external audit of our financial practices, HR policies, and corporate governance. The audit was scheduled to conclude with a presentation to the board of directors at the next quarterly meeting in 6 weeks. The external auditing firm, Caldwell & Associates, was highly reputable. They were known for thorough, independent investigations. The lead auditor, Thomas Caldwell, had built his reputation on integrity and refusing to compromise his findings for client relationships. This was my opportunity. 3 weeks after Brandon docked my bonus, I filed a formal complaint through the company's ethics hotline. The hotline was supposed to be anonymous and independent, managed by an external company to protect whistleblowers from retaliation. I spent hours crafting my submission, detailing every instance of fraud, fabricated documentation, and wrongful bonus reductions. I included testimony from 5 other affected employees who agreed to be identified. I attached copies of Margaret's sworn statement and my photographic evidence. The ethics hotline policy promised a response within 7 business days. I waited anxiously, hoping that finally, someone with authority would investigate Brandon's actions. 3 days later, my phone rang. Brandon's assistant asked me to report to the conference room on the 3rd floor immediately for a meeting with Brandon and the company's legal counsel. My stomach dropped. The ethics hotline was supposed to be anonymous. How did Brandon know I filed a complaint? I walked into that conference room knowing I was walking into a trap. Brandon sat at the head of the table with a smug expression. Next to him sat Gerald Patterson, the company's legal counsel, a man in his mid-50s with silver hair and an expensive suit. "Sit down, Wilma," Gerald said, gesturing to a chair across from them. I sat, keeping my expression neutral despite my racing heart. Brandon opened a folder. "We've received some concerning reports about your behavior over the past few weeks. Multiple employees have complained that you're creating a hostile work environment and spreading false rumors about management." "That's not true," I said immediately. "I haven't spread any rumors. I filed a legitimate complaint about documented fraud and wrongful retaliation." Gerald leaned forward. "The complaint you filed contains serious allegations that, frankly, appear to be fabricated in an attempt to avoid accountability for your own performance issues. We have witness statements from several of your team members describing your difficult behavior and poor management approach. I want to see those statements, I said. Gerald pulled out several printed pages. I'm afraid I can't share the actual documents due to confidentiality concerns, but I can summarize them. Your team members report that you're frequently argumentative, dismissive of feedback, and create an atmosphere of tension. I felt my anger rising. Who said these things? I want names. We're not required to disclose that information, Brandon interjected. What matters is that your behavior is creating problems, and we need to address it. One of the statements he mentioned was supposedly from Jennifer, a junior project coordinator on my team. But Jennifer had left the company 4 months earlier to take a position in Seattle. How could she have provided a recent statement about my current behavior? I pointed this out. Brandon and Gerald exchanged a glance. There was a brief pause before Gerald spoke. The statement was obtained before her departure, reflecting ongoing concerns about your management style. It was an obvious lie. Jennifer's departure predated Brandon's arrival by 2 months. She couldn't have complained about issues that didn't exist yet. I want to see the original signed statements with dates, I insisted. Gerald's expression hardened. We're under no obligation to provide that level of detail. What you need to focus on is improving your behavior going forward. Then Brandon delivered the next blow. Based on the seriousness of these concerns and the disruptive nature of your recent actions, we're placing you on administrative leave pending investigation. The leave will be for 2 weeks, effective immediately, and will be unpaid. My breath caught. Unpaid? Company policy clearly stated that administrative leave during investigations must be paid unless the employee has already been formally disciplined for similar issues. Company policy requires paid leave during investigations, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Gerald shook his head. That policy applies when the investigation concerns alleged violations by third parties. When the investigation concerns your own behavior, unpaid leave is appropriate. That wasn't true, but arguing further seemed pointless. You'll need to gather your personal belongings and return your access badge, laptop, and company phone immediately, Brandon said. You're not to contact any current employees during your leave, and you're prohibited from entering company property. If you violate these terms, we'll consider it grounds for immediate termination. 20 minutes later, a security guard escorted me to my desk while I packed my personal items into a cardboard box. My team watched from their workstations, confused and concerned. I couldn't explain what was happening because Brandon had forbidden contact with employees. I couldn't even say goodbye properly. The security guard walked me to the parking lot and watched as I loaded the box into my car. 7 years of dedication ended with a humiliating perp walk, while my colleagues watched from office windows. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before I could drive. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I felt defeated, powerless, isolated. Brandon had systematically destroyed my career, fabricated evidence against me, and turned the system that was supposed to protect employees into a weapon against them. The next 2 weeks were the darkest period of my professional life. I sat at home, worried about mortgage payments and health insurance. I sent careful text messages to Sarah, the only colleague I trusted enough to maintain contact despite Brandon's prohibition. She kept me informed about what was happening at the office. Brandon was interviewing candidates for my position. He told my team I was under investigation for serious misconduct but wouldn't provide details. The ambiguity allowed people's imaginations to run wild. Some team members assumed I had done something terrible. Others suspected the truth but were too afraid to speak up. David sent me a message through a personal email account, taking a risk to check on me. He said morale was terrible. People were afraid to speak freely. Several good employees had started quietly looking for other jobs, genuinely afraid they would be next. I spent sleepless nights researching options. I could hire an employment attorney, but litigation would take years and cost tens of thousands of dollars. I could file complaints with state and federal agencies, but investigations moved slowly and offered no guarantee of justice. I could simply accept defeat, find another job, and move on with my life. But that last option felt like letting Brandon win. It meant letting him continue destroying careers without consequence. It meant abandoning my colleagues who were still suffering under his regime. Late one night, unable to sleep, I researched corporate fraud and whistleblower protections. I read about the legal obligations of external auditors and the protections afforded to employees who report fraud during audits. I reviewed the timeline for Garrison Technologies' ongoing external audit. The quarterly board meeting with the external auditor was scheduled for exactly 10 days from that moment. Thomas Caldwell from Caldwell & Associates would present his audit findings directly to the board of directors. His report would include assessments of HR practices, compensation structures, and corporate governance. Most importantly, he reported directly to the board, not to Brandon or even to Richard. He had no incentive to cover up problems, and every professional incentive to report fraud. This was my chance. My only chance. But I was banned from company property. I couldn't present my evidence at the meeting. I needed to get my documentation to Thomas Caldwell before the board meeting so he could investigate independently. I spent the next 3 days compiling a comprehensive dossier. It included 47 pages of documented evidence, my fabricated performance improvement plan, Margaret's notarized sworn statement, testimony from affected employees, my photographic evidence, timeline of events, copies of positive performance reviews, client testimonials, and most importantly, Sarah's documentation about backdated documents. I also included information I had recently learned from Sarah. The ethics hotline wasn't actually independent. It was managed by a company owned by Brandon's former business school roommate. Reports filed through the hotline went directly to Brandon. There had never been any real anonymity or protection. The system designed to protect whistleblowers had been compromised to identify and target them instead. I wrote a detailed cover letter explaining everything in professional, factual language. I cited specific legal obligations and highlighted the fraud involved in backdating documents and fabricating personnel records. Then I had to figure out how to get it to Thomas Caldwell. I researched Caldwell & Associates and found their office address in downtown Austin. I prepared 2 copies of my dossier. I sent one via certified mail requiring a signature confirmation. I sent another via email to Thomas Caldwell's professional address with the subject line, Urgent, Fraud Documentation for Garrison Technologies Audit. In my email, I explained who I was, what had happened, and why I was bringing this to his attention. I offered to meet with him in person to answer questions and provide additional evidence. I included my personal phone number and email address. I also sent copies of everything to a personal attorney I hired, creating a paper trail that would protect me if anything happened to the original documentation. After I sent the materials, I felt a strange combination of relief and terror. I had done everything I could. The evidence was now in the hands of someone who had the power and professional obligation to investigate. But I had also made myself a larger target. If Brandon discovered what I had done before the board meeting, he would find a way to discredit me or the evidence. 3 days before the board meeting, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Caldwell & Associates. "Miss Henderson?" A man's voice said. "This is Thomas Caldwell. I received your submission. Can we meet tomorrow to discuss your documentation?" "Yes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm available anytime." We met the next morning at a coffee shop near his office. Thomas Caldwell was in his late 50s with gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. He carried a briefcase containing my dossier, now marked with colored tabs and handwritten notes. "I've spent the last 2 days verifying your claims," he said after we ordered coffee. "I contacted Margaret Hendricks in Florida. I interviewed several employees off-site using confidential channels. I had our forensic accounting team review the compensation adjustments you documented. Everything you submitted checks out." I felt tears welling up. Someone finally believed me. "What you've documented is serious corporate fraud," he continued. Backdated documents, fabricated personnel records, misappropriation of funds through wrongful bonus reductions, and obstruction of the ethics reporting system. This goes far beyond poor management. These are potentially criminal acts. What happens now? I asked. I'm presenting my audit findings to the board in 2 days, he said. Your documentation will be a significant part of my report. I'm recommending immediate action to address these violations and protect affected employees. I'm also recommending a broader investigation to determine the full scope of the fraud. He looked at me seriously. I want you to know that what you did took tremendous courage. Most people would have just accepted the situation and moved on. You chose to fight for what's right, and you did it with meticulous documentation and professionalism. That matters. I left that meeting feeling hopeful for the first time in weeks. The board meeting was in 2 days. Brandon had no idea what was coming. The quarterly board meeting took place on a Tuesday morning in the executive conference room on the 5th floor of Garrison Technologies headquarters. I wasn't present, of course. I was still on suspension, banned from company property. But Sarah, who had access to executive floor areas as part of her accounting duties, positioned herself strategically nearby and reported everything to me afterward. The meeting attendees included CEO Richard Garrison, 5 board members, the CFO, General Counsel Gerald Patterson, Brandon as head of HR, and Thomas Caldwell, representing the external audit firm. According to Sarah, the meeting began with standard quarterly business. Financial reports showed strong performance. Several new contracts were progressing well. The mood was optimistic and routine. Then it was Brandon's turn to present his HR department update. Sarah said he walked to the front of the room with confidence, clicking through slides showing his new metrics. He talked about increased accountability, optimized compensation structures, and improved retention in key positions. He specifically mentioned that several problem employees had been placed on performance improvement plans or were being transitioned out of the company. He used my situation as an example of necessary corrective action against an employee who had created a hostile work environment. The board members nodded along. Nothing seemed unusual yet. Then Thomas Caldwell began his audit report. He covered standard financial controls and accounting practices first. Everything appeared routine. The board members looked relaxed, expecting a clean audit with minor recommendations. Then Thomas reached the HR section of his report. As part of standard audit procedure, I conducted random sampling of personnel files to verify proper documentation and compliance with employment law, he said. I'd like to focus on one file in particular that raised significant concerns. He opened a folder and pulled out documents. He began reading aloud about my case. The fabricated performance improvement plan, the false complaints, the wrongful bonus reduction, the retaliatory suspension, without pay. Sarah said she watched from the doorway as Thomas suddenly stopped reading mid-sentence. He looked at the documents in his hands, and then looked up at Brandon. Then he started laughing. It wasn't a joyful laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had just discovered something so audacious, so brazen in its fraud, that he couldn't quite believe someone thought they would get away with it. Brandon's confident smirk began to fade. The board members leaned forward, suddenly alert. Richard Garrison's expression shifted from casual interest to concern. Thomas slid a document across the mahogany table directly toward Richard. Mr. Garrison, I need to show you something your son apparently didn't think anyone would discover. The room went completely silent. Thomas explained that 4 days before the meeting, he had received a comprehensive whistleblower submission from me. He had spent 72 hours conducting an intensive secondary investigation. He personally verified every claim in my dossier. He contacted Margaret Hendricks, who confirmed under oath that she never wrote negative reviews or created performance improvement plans for me. He interviewed 10 employees off-site through confidential channels. Every single one reported experiencing retaliation under Brandon's leadership. Then Thomas did something that made Brandon's face go pale. He had brought a forensic accountant from his firm, who had analyzed Garrison Technologies' compensation records. Thomas projected financial records on the conference room screen. The display showed something that shocked everyone in the room. Over 6 months, Brandon had docked approximately $300,000 in employee bonuses, but that money hadn't returned to the company's general operating funds as Brandon had claimed. Instead, the docked bonuses had been reclassified as executive performance incentives and redistributed to specific individuals. Thomas showed the money trail. $150,000 had been paid to Brandon himself as HR efficiency bonuses that had never been approved by the board. $50,000 went to Brandon's assistant and Gerald Patterson, the legal counsel. Another $75,000 went to 3 newly hired consultants who, Thomas revealed, were Brandon's friends from his failed Silicon Valley startup. Thomas presented his investigation results methodically. The consultants had never produced any deliverables. There were no project plans, no timesheets, no work product. They were shell entities created solely to funnel money to Brandon's associates. The payments had been approved by Brandon, without proper board oversight or authorization. Then Thomas revealed the backdating operation. He had documentation from a whistleblower showing that Brandon's assistant had been printing documents and manually adding dates from months earlier, during Margaret's tenure. These fabricated documents were being inserted into personnel files to justify retaliatory actions against employees. Finally, Thomas addressed the compromised ethics hotline. He presented evidence that the supposedly independent reporting system was managed by a company owned by Brandon's former business school roommate. Anonymous complaints filed through the hotline went directly to Brandon, allowing him to identify and target whistleblowers. Brandon tried to defend himself. "These are just performance-based adjustments," he said, his voice rising. "The consultants provided strategic guidance. The efficiency bonuses reflect my successful transformation of the HR department." Thomas cut him off coldly. "Mr. Garrison, you backdated documents, created false personnel records, embezzled company funds, and compromised the ethics reporting system. These aren't management decisions. These are criminal acts." Richard Garrison looked at his son with an expression that Sarah described as devastating. The CEO who had built this company from nothing was watching his son destroy his life's work through fraud and corruption. The board members were furious. One demanded immediate action. Another asked how this had been allowed to happen. A third questioned Gerald Patterson's role in covering up the scheme. Gerald turned pale and started stammering about limited information and relying on Brandon's representations. Brandon made one last attempt to save himself. "Dad," he said, looking at Richard desperately. "You know I was trying to help the company. These employees were disloyal. I was protecting our interests." Richard's response was quiet but firm. "No, Brandon. You betrayed every principle this company was built on. You hurt good people who dedicated years to our success. And you did it for money and power." He turned to the board. "I recommend we immediately reinstate all affected employees with full back pay and damages. I recommend we terminate Brandon's employment effective immediately. And I recommend we cooperate fully with any criminal investigation that results from these findings." The board voted unanimously to accept all recommendations. Security was called. 2 guards entered the conference room. Brandon was escorted from the building. His employment terminated on the spot. Gerald Patterson was suspended, pending a separate investigation. Thomas Caldwell then made a statement that Sarah said brought tears to several board members' eyes. "I want the board to understand something," Thomas said. "This fraud was uncovered because one employee, Wilma Henderson, had the courage to document everything and bring it forward despite facing severe retaliation. She lost her income, her reputation, and her peace of mind to protect this company and her colleagues. Her actions exemplify integrity. I strongly recommend the board recognize her contribution and ensure she is compensated for what she endured." Richard nodded. "Contact Miss Henderson immediately. Offer her full reinstatement with back pay, a formal apology, and whatever else we can do to make this right." Sarah called me as soon as the meeting ended. I was at home, pacing in my kitchen, desperate for news. "Wilma," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He's gone." Brandon's fired. They know everything. Thomas Caldwell exposed all of it. The board wants you back immediately. I sank into a chair, overwhelmed. It was over. Justice was actually happening. That afternoon, I received a call from Richard Garrison himself. His voice was heavy with remorse. Miss Henderson, I owe you an apology that words cannot adequately express. My son betrayed the trust of this company and harmed good people. You suffered terribly because I failed to supervise him properly. I want you to return to Garrison Technologies immediately with full back pay, restored bonuses, and a formal written apology. But more than that, I want to know how we can make this right. 2 days later, I returned to the office. My team greeted me with applause and visible relief. Several people hugged me. Tom, one of the engineers, had tears in his eyes. We knew something was wrong, he said. But we didn't know how to fight it. You fought for all of us. The board's immediate actions were just the beginning. They hired an independent forensic investigation firm to examine the full scope of Brandon's fraud. Over the next 2 weeks, investigators interviewed employees, reviewed documentation, analyzed financial records, and reconstructed everything that happened during Brandon's 6-month tenure. The results were even more damaging than anyone initially realized. Investigators discovered that Brandon hadn't just been retaliating against employees randomly. He had a systematic plan. He maintained a target list of 23 employees, all of them long-term, competent, loyal staff who might oppose his changes or who held positions he wanted to give to his associates. He was documenting false performance issues for every person on that list, building fraudulent files that would justify their eventual termination. The plan was already in motion. He had hired 12 replacement employees, all personal associates from Silicon Valley, with inflated credentials and minimal actual qualifications. These individuals were being paid premium salaries, while the experienced employees they were meant to replace had their bonuses docked and their reputations destroyed. But the most shocking discovery came from the investigators' forensic analysis of Brandon's email account. They found correspondence between Brandon and his Silicon Valley associates discussing what they called their 5-year plan to take over Garrison Technologies. The emails laid out their strategy in explicit detail. Phase 1 involved gaining control of HR and systematically replacing existing staff with their own people. Phase 2 involved influencing board decisions through planted allies in key positions. Phase 3 involved convincing the board that Richard was outdated and should step down or transition to an emeritus role. Phase 4 involved installing Brandon as CEO with complete control of the company. The emails showed shocking disrespect for Richard and contempt for the company's founding principles. Brandon and his associates referred to long-term employees as deadweight and discussed how to manufacture legal justification for mass terminations. They projected that within 5 years, they could strip enough value from Garrison Technologies to either sell it at a premium or take it public and cash out. It wasn't just fraud. It was an attempted corporate coup orchestrated against Brandon's own father. When Richard read those emails, Sarah told me he locked himself in his office for 2 hours. When he emerged, he looked 10 years older. The board immediately contacted the district attorney's office. A criminal investigation was opened. Brandon was arrested and charged with embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. His bail was set at $250,000. Gerald Patterson, the legal counsel who had helped cover up the scheme, was suspended from practicing law pending a disbarment proceeding. 3 of Brandon's Silicon Valley associates who had received the fraudulent consulting payments were subpoenaed. 2 of them immediately hired lawyers and refused to testify. The third agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity and provided detailed testimony about the entire scheme. The impact on Garrison Technologies was profound. All 23 targeted employees were personally contacted by Richard. He apologized to each person individually, explained what had happened, and offered to make things right. The false documentation was removed from personnel files and destroyed. Original, accurate performance reviews were reinstated. All docked bonuses were returned with 10% interest to compensate for the time value of money and the stress caused. Several employees who had been forced to resign under pressure were offered their positions back with full compensation for lost wages. 3 of them accepted. 2 had already found better opportunities and declined, though they appreciated the gesture. The company held an all-hands meeting, where Richard addressed what happened. He stood at the front of the conference room, the same room where Brandon had announced his accountability initiative 6 months earlier. Richard's speech was raw and honest. "I owe all of you an apology," he said. "I brought my son into this company and gave him authority he hadn't earned. I prioritized family loyalty over the values this company was built on. Because of my failure to provide proper oversight, good people suffered. Careers were damaged. Trust was broken. That responsibility rests with me," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. Wilma, Henderson, and others showed tremendous courage in documenting what was happening and bringing it forward. They saved this company from destruction. They protected your careers and your livelihoods. I am implementing new oversight structures, so nothing like this can ever happen again. I am also establishing a whistleblower protection fund to support any employee who reports misconduct in the future. You have my commitment that this company will return to the principles it was founded on: integrity, respect, and fairness. The room was silent when he finished. Then someone started clapping. Within seconds, the entire company was applauding. Not for Richard, but for the commitment he had just made. After the meeting, Richard asked me to come to his office. He sat across from me, looking exhausted and ashamed. "Wilma, I need you to know that what happened to you is the worst failure of my career. You dedicated 7 years to this company, and I allowed my son to destroy your reputation and livelihood. No amount of money or apologies can undo that harm." He handed me an envelope. Inside was a formal offer letter. Director of Operations, a position higher than Senior Project Manager, and higher than the Director of Project Management role I had been promised before Brandon arrived. The salary was $110,000 annually, a 46% increase from my previous $75,000 salary. Also included was a check for back pay covering my 2-week suspension, with an additional 50% premium to compensate for the wrongful nature of the suspension. My docked bonus was fully restored, bringing me the original $5,000 plus 10% interest. And there was an additional integrity bonus of $20,000 to recognize my courage in exposing the fraud. "This is just the beginning," Richard said. "The board has designated you as Employee of the Year. We're implementing many of your suggestions about HR reform, and we're creating a new ethics oversight committee that reports directly to the board, independent of management. I'd like you to serve on that committee." I accepted the position. Not because the money erased what happened, but because I believed Richard was genuine in his commitment to change. The local business press covered the story extensively. Tech industry publications ran articles about corporate fraud and the importance of whistleblower protections. I was interviewed by a local television news station. I focused my comments on the need for systemic accountability and employee protections, not on personal vindication. The story resonated. I received messages from employees at other companies describing similar situations they were facing. Several credited my story with giving them courage to document and report misconduct. One woman told me that my example helped her expose a manager who was sexually harassing junior employees. I also received job offers from 3 competing firms who valued what I had done. I appreciated the offers but declined. I had invested too much in Garrison Technologies to leave now, and I believed the company was genuinely transforming into something better. 6 months after the board meeting where Thomas Caldwell exposed Brandon's fraud, Brandon pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud charges in federal court. His attorney negotiated a plea deal. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison at a minimum security facility. He was ordered to repay all embezzled funds, plus penalties, totaling $380,000. He would also be required to complete 200 hours of community service after his release. His criminal record would make future employment in corporate leadership nearly impossible. At 29 years old, his career was effectively over. Richard refused to use family money to hire expensive defense attorneys for Brandon. He believed his son needed to face the full consequences of his actions. It was the hardest decision he had ever made as a father, but he believed it was the right one. 6 months after the board meeting, Garrison Technologies looked completely different. The changes went far beyond just removing Brandon and his associates. The company underwent a fundamental cultural transformation. The board hired a new HR director named Carol Jennings. She came with 23 years of experience, impeccable credentials, and a reputation for fairness and professionalism. Her first action was to conduct a comprehensive review of every HR policy. She eliminated the punitive accountability measures Brandon had implemented and replaced them with supportive, transparent performance management systems. Carol established multiple reporting channels for employee concerns. She created an ombudsman position, independent of HR and management, where employees could raise issues confidentially. She implemented quarterly anonymous surveys to assess workplace culture and identify problems before they escalated. She required all managers, including herself, to complete extensive training on employment law, ethics, and respectful workplace practices. The ethics hotline was completely overhauled. The board terminated the contract with Brandon's friend's company and hired a nationally recognized firm with genuine independence and strong whistleblower protections. Reports now went directly to the board's ethics committee, not to management. The system included multiple safeguards to protect anonymous reporters. Perhaps most importantly, the company established a whistleblower protection fund with $500,000 in dedicated funding. Any employee who reported misconduct and faced retaliation would receive financial support for legal fees, living expenses during investigations, and counseling services. The fund sent a clear message: the company would protect people who spoke up. The cultural impact was dramatic. Employee satisfaction scores, which had plummeted during Brandon's tenure, increased significantly. Quarterly surveys showed that 87% of employees felt the company treated them fairly, up from 42% during Brandon's time. Turnover of top talent dropped from 18% annually to 6%. Productivity increased. Client satisfaction improved. In my new role as Director of Operations, I led several initiatives that improved how the company functioned. I implemented transparent project allocation systems so everyone understood how work was distributed. I created mentorship programs pairing senior staff with newer employees. I established regular skip-level meetings where employees could speak directly with executives without their immediate managers present. I also served on the board's Ethics Oversight Committee, reviewing reports of misconduct and ensuring they were handled appropriately. We investigated 7 reports in the first 6 months. 4 were resolved through mediation and policy clarification. 2 resulted in manager retraining. 1 resulted in a termination for documented harassment. Every case was handled with thorough investigation and fairness. The transformation extended to Richard himself. He underwent leadership counseling to understand how he had enabled Brandon's behavior through favoritism and inadequate oversight. He became much more present and engaged with employees at all levels. He started eating lunch in the cafeteria regularly, sitting with different teams each week and asking about their work and concerns. He also became a public advocate for family business ethics. He spoke at conferences about the lessons he learned from his failure. He advised other business owners about the dangers of nepotism and the importance of accountability, even for family members. He was remarkably candid about his mistakes and the damage they caused. Richard worked to repair his relationship with the board, which had been strained by his poor judgment in hiring Brandon without proper vetting. He agreed to new oversight structures, limiting his unilateral authority over senior appointments. He accepted performance evaluations, just like any other executive. He demonstrated genuine humility and commitment to improvement. The affected employees from Brandon's tenure all recovered professionally. David, the software engineer who was one of the first targets, was promoted to senior software architect. His bonus was fully restored. plus an apology bonus. He and his wife had their baby nursery fully furnished, and he told me he felt valued at work for the first time in months. Sarah from accounting, who had risked her job to provide evidence of the backdating operation, was promoted to assistant controller. The CFO personally thanked her for her courage and integrity. She became a key member of the financial controls team, helping implement safeguards against future fraud. Tom and Jennifer, the other project coordinators who had been targeted, both received promotions and significant bonuses. Tom told me he had started looking for other jobs during Brandon's tenure but now felt completely committed to Garrison Technologies. 3 of the employees who had been forced to resign returned to the company. One of them, a talented database administrator named Marcus, said he had been devastated when Brandon drove him out. His return, with a promotion and a public acknowledgement of the wrong done to him, meant everything. The 12 associates Brandon had hired as part of his takeover scheme were all terminated. Their positions were evaluated, and about half were deemed unnecessary. The other positions were filled through legitimate hiring processes with qualified candidates. The media attention around the case had unexpected positive effects. Garrison Technologies gained a reputation as a company that took ethics seriously and protected whistleblowers. Several talented professionals specifically sought jobs with the company because of that reputation. Clients appreciated the transparency and commitment to integrity. The company won the major government contract it had been pursuing, partly because the government was impressed by how thoroughly the company addressed the fraud once discovered. I personally received recognition beyond the company. A local business association gave me their Ethics in Leadership Award. A women's professional organization invited me to speak at their annual conference. Several universities asked me to guest lecture in their business ethics courses, but the most meaningful recognition came from my colleagues. People I had worked with for years told me they had always respected my work, but now they respected my character. New employees heard the story and approached me for mentorship. My team, which had supported me throughout the ordeal, grew stronger and more cohesive. The emotional toll of what I experienced took time to heal. I worked with a therapist to process the stress, fear, and sense of betrayal. There were nights when I still woke up anxious, remembering the feeling of helplessness during my suspension. But gradually, with professional help and support from friends and colleagues, I regained my sense of security and confidence. One afternoon, about 8 months after the board meeting, I was working in my office when Richard knocked on my door. He asked if I had a few minutes. We sat in my office's small conference area. "Wilma, I want you to know something," he said. "What you didn't just save individual careers. You saved this company. If your documentation hadn't exposed Brandon's scheme, he would have continued. Within a few years, he would have destroyed everything I spent 3 decades building. The company would have collapsed or been gutted. Hundreds of people would have lost their jobs. You prevented that." I appreciated his words, but I corrected him gently. "I didn't do it to save the company, Richard. I did it because what was happening was wrong. People were being hurt. I couldn't stand by and watch that continue." He nodded. "That's exactly why it mattered. You acted based on principle, not personal benefit. That's real integrity." He stood to leave, then paused. "I've been a CEO for 30 years. I've made a lot of business decisions. But the decision to truly listen to what you documented and take action is the one I'm most proud of. Thank you for giving me that opportunity." After he left, I sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on the journey from that terrifying board meeting 8 months ago to this moment of peace and restoration. Justice had been served. Not perfectly, not without cost, but genuinely. And that meant something. A full year after Thomas Caldwell stopped reading my file mid-sentence and started laughing, I stood in the same conference room where everything changed. This time, I was leading a quarterly operations review as Director of Operations. Richard attended, along with several board members, department heads, and Carol Jennings, our excellent HR director. I presented results showing improved employee engagement, reduce turnover, increase productivity, and higher client satisfaction. The metrics told a clear story. When you treat people with dignity and fairness, they thrive. After the meeting ended and others filed out, I stayed behind for a moment. I stood at the window, looking out at the Austin skyline. I thought about everything that happened in this building over the past year. The fear, the anger, the determination, the vindication, the healing. I thought about the night I almost gave up, sitting at home during my suspension, wondering if fighting was worth the cost. I thought about the moment I decided to document everything and send it to Thomas Caldwell, taking the biggest risk of my career. I thought about the phone call from Richard offering me reinstatement and the gradual rebuilding of trust. Most of all, I thought about the lesson that emerged from the entire experience. The most powerful thing you can do in the face of injustice is refuse to be silent. When I saw what Brandon was doing, when I experienced the retaliation firsthand, I had a choice. I could accept it, move on quietly, and let him continue hurting others. Or, I could document everything, gather evidence, and fight back even when the system seemed rigged against me. I chose to fight, not because I was certain I would win, but because silence would have made me complicit in the harm being done to my colleagues. That choice required meticulous documentation. I photographed emails, saved performance reviews, collected witness testimony, and built an undeniable case. Documentation turned my word against Brandon's word into objective evidence against fraud. Without that evidence, Thomas Caldwell couldn't have verified my claims. Without verification, the board might have dismissed my allegations as a disgruntled employee's complaints. The experience taught me that systems can fail, and people can disappoint. The ethics hotline that was supposed to protect me was compromised. The legal counsel who should have ensured fairness instead helped cover up fraud. The family relationship between Richard and Brandon created a conflict of interest that allowed abuse to continue. But systems can also work when good people insist they work properly. Thomas Caldwell had a professional obligation to conduct a thorough audit, and he took that obligation seriously. When presented with credible evidence of fraud, he investigated rather than looking the other way. The board, when finally confronted with undeniable proof, chose integrity over convenience. Richard, despite the personal pain of his son's betrayal, chose accountability over protection. I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. I was terrified every step of the way. I was afraid of losing my job, my reputation, my financial security. I was afraid that no one would believe me, or that the evidence wouldn't be enough. I was afraid of retaliation and professional destruction. But courage is doing what's right, even when you're afraid. It's sending that documentation to the auditor even though you don't know if he'll take it seriously. It's risking everything, because the alternative is allowing injustice to continue. I also learned about the importance of allies. Sarah risked her position to provide evidence of backdated documents. David maintained contact during my suspension. Despite Brandon's prohibition, Margaret provided sworn testimony even though she was retired and had nothing to gain. Thomas Caldwell conducted a thorough investigation because he believed in professional integrity. Each person made a choice to support truth over convenience. The transformation of Garrison Technologies showed me that organizations can change. The same company that enabled Brandon's fraud for 6 months became a model of ethical business practices. It required leadership commitment, systemic reforms, and cultural change, but it happened. Companies aren't inherently good or bad. They're shaped by the people within them and the systems that govern their behavior. Richard's transformation was particularly meaningful. He could have defended his son, minimized the damage, or blamed others. Instead, he took full responsibility, implemented real changes, and became a public advocate for the lessons he learned. He showed that accountability and growth are possible even after serious failures. The experience changed how I view my career and my role in organizations. I'm no longer just focused on delivering projects and meeting deadlines. I actively watch for signs of misconduct or abuse. I support colleagues who raise concerns. I advocate for transparent systems and protections for people who speak up. I share my story with others to give them courage to document and report problems. I also learned to recognize my own value. Brandon tried to make me believe I was a problem employee, whose complaints reflected personal failings rather than legitimate concerns. The fabricated performance reviews and false accusations were designed to make me doubt myself. But I knew my actual performance record. I knew my contributions were valuable. I refused to internalize his lies. That self-knowledge was crucial. If I had believed Brandon's false narrative, I might have accepted the bonus reduction and retaliatory suspension as deserved consequences. Instead, I trusted my own assessment of my work and recognized his actions as retaliation rather than legitimate management. Looking out that conference room window, I felt deep gratitude for how things resolved. Not everyone who faces workplace retaliation gets vindication. Not every company implements genuine reforms after misconduct. Not every whistleblower receives recognition rather than ongoing punishment. I was fortunate that circumstances aligned in ways that allowed truth to prevail. But fortune wasn't the only factor. Preparation, documentation, courage, and persistence mattered tremendously. I created my own luck by refusing to give up and by building a case so thoroughly documented that it couldn't be dismissed. The experience reinforced my belief that individuals have power to influence systems and organizations. One person with integrity and determination can make a difference. Brandon had positional authority, family connections, and control over HR records. But I had truth and documentation. In the end, truth backed by evidence was more powerful than authority backed by lies. As I walked out of the conference room that day, heading back to my office where my team was working on projects, I felt at peace. I had fought for what was right. I had protected my colleagues and my company. I had faced fear and chose courage. I had endured injustice and insisted on accountability. The journey was painful, but the outcome validated every difficult choice I made. The final lesson I carried forward was perhaps the most important. Your voice matters. Your truth matters. And you should never let anyone convince you otherwise. When you witness injustice, you have a choice to speak up or stay silent. Speaking up is frightening and uncertain. But silence allows harm to continue and makes you complicit in that harm. I chose to speak, and that choice changed everything. If you've ever faced workplace retaliation, unfair treatment, or witnessed misconduct, I want you to know that you're not alone and you're not powerless. Document everything. Build your case carefully. Find trustworthy allies. Look for external authorities who can act independently. Trust that truth matters and that systems can work when people insist they work properly. Most importantly, believe in your own worth and your right to fair treatment. Don't internalize false narratives designed to silence you. Your integrity is your most valuable asset, and no job or bonus is worth compromising it. The path forward isn't easy, but it's possible. Justice isn't guaranteed, but it's more likely when people refuse to accept injustice quietly. Your courage might not just save your own career, it might protect countless others who would have been harmed if you had stayed silent. That's the power of speaking truth. It ripples outward in ways you can't always predict or measure, but the ripples matter, the impact is real, and your voice is worth raising. Have you ever experienced workplace retaliation or witnessed unfair treatment? What did you do about it? And looking back, what do you wish you had done differently? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might give someone else the courage they need to stand up for what's right. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about everyday people who face difficult situations with courage and integrity. Share this video with anyone who might need encouragement to speak up in their own workplace. Sometimes, knowing that others have walked this path and survived makes all the difference. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reminds you that you have more power than you think, that your voice matters, and that standing up for what's right, even when it's terrifying, is always worth it. Take care of yourselves, trust your integrity, and never stop fighting for fairness and justice in your workplace and your life.